The German major had survived Stalingrad. He had outlasted 3 Allied attacks on his fortress. He had 150 men, walls 3 feet thick, and enough ammunition to hold until winter. Then one morning, 60 soldiers appeared behind those walls, where no enemy had ever been, where no enemy was supposed to be able to go. And he realized, standing at the edge of a cliff in the pale Italian dawn, that none of it mattered anymore. Or what those 60 men did the night before, and what happened in the 3 hours that followed, would end the German hold on this mountain without a single shot being fired. And within 72 hours, 17 other German fortresses along the same mountain would surrender at the mere sight of these soldiers approaching. Not because of tanks, not because of bombs, because of what 60 men were willing to do in total darkness, in total silence. With 60 pounds on their backs and no rope between them and the ground 400 feet below. The mountain had been killing men for 4 months, not because of what was on top of it, but because of what was inside it. Bunkers cut from rock and sealed in concrete 3 feet thick, machine guns positioned to cover every path leading up, and a German commander who had come back from the Eastern Front when most of his regiment had not, a man who understood, and with the cold precision of hard experience, exactly how to make attackers pay in blood for every yard of ground. 3 British assaults, 3 failures, 340 men dead or wounded. The road to Rome ran through the shadow of this mountain, and it had been closed for weeks. British commanders sat in their tents at night and studied their maps and found no answer, because the answer was not on any map they had. It was standing at the base of the mountain, and looking up at a cliff that everyone agreed was impossible to climb, and quietly disagreeing. His name was Dalbir Thapa. He was 26 years old. He had grown up on a mountain steeper than this one, and he had an idea that the British Army had already said no to twice. They had a name for it by March. Not an official name. Not the kind that appeared on military maps or in the dispatches that went back to London. The men who had fought there called it the mountain that ate armies. The ones who hadn't fought there yet called it Monte Cassino. By April, most of them had stopped using either name. They just called it the mountain, the way you refer to something that has taken on a size beyond its geography, something that has become less a place and more a condition of your existence. It sat above everything. That was the first thing you understood when you saw it. Not beside the road to Rome, not near the road to Rome, above it, watching it, owning it. Every vehicle that moved on that road moved inside the sight lines of the German guns on that mountain. Every column of soldiers, every supply truck, every ambulance crawling south with its wounded, all of it visible, all of it reachable. The mountain did not need to fire constantly to control the road. It only needed to exist. That was enough. That had been enough for 4 months. 3 attacks. The British had come 3 times with everything their doctrine said should work. The first time, an infantry. 200 men moving up the main approach in a column, rifles up, doing what infantry had been trained to do. The German machine guns had been waiting, not frantic, not panicked, waiting, the way a man waits for something he has planned for. 80 men died in the first 5 minutes. The rest came back down the hill, dragging the ones who could still be dragged, and the German guns went quiet again, and the mountain looked exactly as it had before. The second time, armor. Our tanks grinding up the road with infantry behind them, the tactical logic being that the tanks would absorb what the men could not. 3 tanks hit buried mines within 400 yards of each other. The road was too narrow to go around. The tanks behind them stopped. The infantry stopped. The mountain waited. The tanks turned around. The third time, artillery. 1,200 shells over 6 hours. The kind of bombardment that shook the ground 2 miles away. And that left gunners' ears ringing for days. That sent up a column of smoke visible from the Allied headquarters. When it was over, when the last shell had fallen and the smoke had begun to thin, the German flag still flew above the monastery ruins at the summit. The concrete had not cracked. The bunkers had not collapsed. The guns that emerged from their positions and swung back toward the approach roads looked from a distance almost bored. 340 casualties, but not one German bunker taken. Inside that fortress lived Major Erich Steinhardt. He was not a man who invited description. He had the quality of certain objects, a well-used tool, a good knife, where the function had become so completely the thing that the appearance almost didn't matter. Tall, though you rarely thought of him as tall because he carried himself in a way that made height irrelevant. His coat was field gray, and he wore it the way men wear coats they have worn through worse weather than this. His face was the face of a man in his late 30s who has stopped registering events as shocking because the particular education of the Eastern Front has left no room for shock. He had arrived at Stalingrad in November 1942. He had left it in January 1943 on a medical transport, one of the few hundred extracted before the encirclement closed. And he did not speak of what he had seen there, not because he was haunted by it, or not only because of that, but because there was no language that quite held it. What the Eastern Front had given him, beyond the obvious, was a quality of stillness. He did not waste energy on events he could not control. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice. He studied the ground he was given, and he built his defense outward from its strengths. And then he waited for the enemy to explain his mistakes to him. The British had explained 3 times now. He had taken notes each time. His position was close to perfect. He knew it and took no particular pride in it, the same way a craftsman takes no pride in measuring correctly. It was simply what the work required. Every path up the mountain pre-sighted, every approach registered with the guns, walls of reinforced concrete that had swallowed 1,200 shells without comment. Of food for 2 months, ammunition for considerably longer than that. Men who had been here long enough to know every shadow and every sound the mountain made at night, who could distinguish, sleeping, between the wind moving through the ruined monastery above them and the sound of a man trying to be quiet. In their tents below, the British commanders bent over their maps and found nothing they had not already found. Every approach covered, every weakness addressed, to every angle either mined or pre-aimed or both. They wrote their reports and sent them upward, and the reports said, in the careful language of men who did not want to say it plainly, that there appeared to be no solution available within current parameters. They were not wrong. Within their parameters, there was no solution. What they did not know, what none of them knew, including Steinhardt, was that one soldier was not looking at the front of the mountain at all, and his father's hands had been like that too. That was the first thing you noticed about Dalbir Thapa. The hands. Not large, not the hands you would pick out of a crowd and think, there is a soldier. But the skin across the knuckles had a particular texture, worn smooth and then rough again in layers, the way rock faces weather over decades. The hands of someone who had been climbing things since before he understood that climbing was a skill and not simply how a person moved through the world. He had grown up in Sindhupalchok, in the hill country northeast of Kathmandu, in a village that did not appear on most maps, and would not have been findable on the ones it did appear on. The nearest town with a market was 3 hours away if the weather was good, and the path there was not a path in any sense a flatland person would recognize. It was a series of decisions, made vertically, about where to put your weight. Then his father made that journey twice a week for 20 years to sell what the family grew and buy what they couldn't. Dalbir had been making it since he was 6. By 12, he knew the route the way other children knew their schoolyards, knew which stones moved and which held, knew how the character of the rock changed after rain, knew how cold affected the limestone at different altitudes, and what that meant for where you could put your foot. The mountain did not frighten him, and that was not bravery. It was more like how a fisherman is not frightened of water, not because the water cannot kill him, but because he has spent so much of his life in its company that fear has been replaced by a different kind of attention, a reading. a continuous, mostly unconscious conversation between his body and the terrain it was moving through. He joined the British Army at 17 because the pay was 11 rupees a month, which was more money than his father cleared in a good season, and because the alternative was the hillside. Not that the hillside was bad. He loved the hillside, but he had a quality that the hillside could not fully accommodate, a restlessness that expressed itself not as ambition exactly, but as a need for problems of a certain difficulty. He needed something to solve. The British Army, it turned out, had an inexhaustible supply. By 26, he was a subadar, which in the structure of the Gurkha battalions meant something more specific than a rank. It meant that when his 60 men looked at a situation and felt the cold loosening in the stomach that precedes either action or retreat, they looked at Dalbir. And if Dalbir's face showed nothing, if he was still in the way, he was, always still, reading the ground, having the conversation, then they stayed. They had learned to trust the stillness. In 9 years of service, in North Africa and then Italy, he had never asked them to do something he had not already decided was possible. He had never yet been wrong. He spent 2 days walking the base of Monte Cassino before he looked at the cliff. The first day, he walked the front approaches, the same ground that had cost the British 3 attacks and 340 casualties. He did not look at it the way the British officers looked at it, as a tactical problem, an equation of firepower and casualties and acceptable loss. Then he looked at it the way he had always looked at terrain, as a conversation he might want to have or might want to decline. The front of the mountain told him very clearly that it did not want company. He filed that away and kept walking. On the afternoon of the second day, he came around to the back. The cliff was approximately 400 feet of near-vertical limestone, and it was, by any reasonable standard of assessment, unclimbable. The angle was wrong, and the holds were sparse, visible from below as small shadows, irregularities, the suggestion of ledges that might bear weight or might not. The surface had the bleached, polished quality of rock that saw no shade, that expanded and contracted through decades of Italian summers and winters until it had shed most of what a climber's fingers could catch. Whoever had built the German defensive position had looked at this cliff and made the correct calculation, which was that it required no guard, no minefield, no pre-aimed gun. It required nothing. It was its own defense. Dalbir studied it for a long time. Then, in the early evening, when the light was going orange and flat and the shadows in the rock face deepened and the holds became easier to read, he stepped up to it and began to climb. He went up 50 feet, slowly, methodically, spending a long time on each hold before committing, learning the rock's particular grammar. At 50 feet, he stopped on a narrow ledge and looked down, then up, then across. He stayed there for perhaps 10 minutes. Then he climbed back down, unhurried, the same deliberate conversation with the stone on the descent. At the bottom, he reached into a crack near the base and picked up a small pebble, gray, smooth, the size of a large coin, and put it in his breast pocket. Colonel Ashworth was waiting at the edge of the Allied camp when Dalbir returned. The colonel was a thorough man, experienced, not unkind, and he had the particular tired patience of someone who has been managing an impossible situation for longer than he expected to. He asked what Dalbir had found. Dalbir said, "The way in." Ashworth looked at him for a long time, the kind of silence that precedes a verdict. Then he said what he had been trained to say, what every measurement of the situation confirmed, what was, by every rational standard, simply true. That cliff cannot be climbed. Dalbir nodded slowly. He was not disagreeing, and he was absorbing it, turning it over the way he turned a hold in rock, testing it before he trusted it with his weight. "I know," he said, "but I can climb it." Ashworth took the proposal to brigade headquarters the following morning. He presented it fairly. Dalbir would have acknowledged that later, if asked. The colonel was not a man who distorted other people's ideas to make them easier to dismiss. He laid it out plainly. A Gurkha subadar believed the cliff at the rear of the German position could be climbed at night in silence by 60 men carrying full equipment. He believed they could reach a ledge 2/3 of the way up before dawn and hold there until the light gave them cover to complete the ascent. He believed this was the way in. The brigadier listened. He asked 2 questions. He was told that no, there were no ropes. The noise of equipment would carry in the darkness. And no, there was no fallback plan if they were spotted on the cliff face. The brigadier was quiet for a moment. Then he used the word suicidal, not cruelly, not dismissively, but in the flat medical tone of a man who has assessed a situation and arrived at a clinical conclusion. It was, he said, suicidal. He wished the subadar well. The meeting was over. Ashworth told Dalbir that afternoon. Dalbir listened without expression and thanked him and went back to his men. He went again the next day. Not to Ashworth. Ashworth had done what he could. He went to the battalion commander, a man named Price Hughes, who had the authority to take the proposal directly to division. Dalbir had prepared for this conversation the way he prepared for climbs, methodically, having thought through every hold before he touched the rock. He had numbers. And he had drawn the cliff from memory and marked the ledge and indicated the angles of approach and the positions of the German sentries, as he had observed them over 2 days of watching. He had, in the careful way of someone who understands that his audience thinks in a particular language, translated his instinct into the grammar of a military briefing. Price Hughes looked at the drawings. He looked at Dalbir. He said the word naive, and then he said the phrase hill farmers with knives. And then both of them landed in the room and stayed there. He did not say them with contempt, or if he did, it was the particular contempt that lives inside certainty, that is indistinguishable from certainty, that does not know it is contempt at all. He genuinely believed he was being accurate. He was describing what he saw. A young man from a peasant village in Nepal, proposing to lead 60 men up an unclimbable cliff at night, armed with rifles and curved blades, and with no support and no extraction plan, against a fortress that had already beaten everything the British Army had sent at it. He was not wrong. That was exactly what it was. The tragedy of those 2 refusals was not that the British commanders were cowards or fools, or even in the ordinary sense, prejudiced men. The tragedy was that they were reasoning correctly from inside a world they understood completely. They had been trained to think in terms of armor and artillery and infantry ratios, and of supply lines and casualty acceptable rates, and the weight of materiel on one side of an equation versus the other. Inside that world, the proposal made no sense. The cliff was unclimbable. The plan was suicidal. The conclusion was obvious. What they lacked, and this was not their fault exactly, or not only their fault, was any way to value what they could not measure. They could not weigh in their equations what it meant to grow up on a mountain, and they had no column in their calculations for 30 years of vertical terrain and limestone grammar and the specific education of a body that has been solving this kind of problem since before it was old enough to understand that not everyone had. They said no, twice. And Dalbir went back to his men, and the mountains sat above them all in the Italian summer heat, and the road to Rome stayed closed. Major Aldous Fentiman had a different problem. His problem was that he had run out of the thing that the Brigadier and Price Hughes still possessed in full. He had run out of certainty. He had been the artillery observer for all 3 British attacks, had sat on a forward ridge with his binoculars and his radio and watched in the particular detail that distance provides everything that had happened. He had watched the infantry charge and the machine guns answer. He had watched the tanks hit the mines. He had called in the 1,200 shells himself, had tracked every impact, had written the assessment that said the bombardment had been accurate and effective, and that the German positions remained structurally intact. He had written that last sentence and then sat with it for a long time. He was not a man given to doubt as a rule, but 3 times watching the same result produces something in a person that is very difficult to argue away. He had started asking himself, quietly, and then less quietly, what exactly they were planning to try next, and whether the planning was being done by men who were still capable of being surprised, or only by men who had decided in advance what was and was not possible. He was friendly with a staff officer at divisional headquarters, not a close friendship, the kind that exists between men who have shared enough difficult meals and enough bad weather to have dispensed with formality. He went to see him on a Tuesday evening and asked one question. He did not argue. He did not present drawings or numbers or a tactical briefing. He asked, "What have we got to lose by letting them try?" He did not know that evening whether anything would come of it. He went back to his ridge and watched the mountain and waited. On June 13th, at 1400 hours, the message came through. 1 attempt, 1 night, no armor support, no artillery cover. If they were spotted on that cliff, no one was coming to help them. Dalbir told his men that evening, not with ceremony, not with a speech about honor or history or what it would mean if they succeeded. He gathered them after the evening meal when the light was going and the air had cooled, and he told them the facts, the cliff, the height, the weight they would carry, the darkness they would climb in, the ledge 2/3 of the way up where they would wait for dawn. He told them there would be no ropes, and he told them there would be no support if they were discovered. He told them they had 3 nights to practice and then 1 night to do it, and that anyone who felt the mission was beyond him should say so now, without consequence, because a man who doubted himself on that cliff was a danger to the man below him. He stopped talking. No one spoke. And a few men looked at each other with the particular expression that passes between soldiers who have been together long enough to have a shared language of glances, something between acknowledgement and dark humor, the look that says, "Of course it's this. It's always something like this." Then they went to get their equipment. The practice cliff was 2 miles south, a limestone face of similar angle and similar height, chosen by Dalbir on the first morning after the permission came through. See, it had one significant advantage over the real one and one significant disadvantage. The advantage was that no one was trying to kill them. The disadvantage was everything else. The holds were different, the rock had a different texture, the ledge system was less forgiving. But it was dark, and it was vertical, and 60 pounds was 60 pounds regardless of which cliff you were carrying it up. The first night was educational in the way that first nights always are, and which is to say it was a systematic introduction to everything they had not anticipated. The weight was the first lesson. 60 pounds of equipment, rifle, ammunition, water, rations, the kukri, distributed across a pack and a belt and a rifle sling, moved differently on a cliff face than it moved on flat ground. It shifted. It pulled. When you reached up for a hold, the pack's weight transferred backward and downward in a way that changed the geometry of the move. And that took a hold that should have been comfortable and made it precarious. Men who had climbed mountains their whole lives found themselves recalculating movements they had made 10,000 times, because the body they were moving was no longer quite the body they knew. The second lesson was the hands. Cold rock and sweating palms were, as Dalbir had told them before the first night, 2 different problems. The cold was manageable. It numbed the fingers over time, but it also dried the skin. And dry skin on cold limestone had reasonable purchase. The sweat was the other thing. It arrived after the first 100 feet, when the exertion had been sustained long enough to override the cool air, and it changed the quality of every hold. Men stopped twice, 3 times, to wipe their palms on their trousers and learned that this was not weakness, it was maintenance, the same as checking a rifle before use. You wiped your hands. You continued. And the third lesson was the silence between them. 60 men on a cliff face in darkness cannot see each other. They can occasionally hear each other, the soft shift of cloth on stone, the controlled exhale of someone who has just made a difficult move. And in that hearing, in that invisible company, there was something that required its own kind of trust. You could not see the man above you. You could not confirm that he was still there, still moving, still choosing good holds. But you could only follow the route he had taken, feeling for the same depressions in the rock, trusting that if he had trusted it, it would hold you too. And the man below trusted the same of you. On the first night, the fastest man reached the top in 2 hours 40. The slowest took 3 hours and 12. 4 men did not complete the climb, not from fear but from cramped hands that lost their grip on the final section and forced a retreat before the fingers locked entirely. The Dalbir noted this and said nothing about it that night. In the morning, he showed those 4 men a grip adjustment for the upper section and sent them back up the cliff in daylight to practice it until the movement was automatic. The second night was better. Not good, better. The weight was still the weight, the hands were still the hands, but the men had begun to metabolize the new arithmetic of their bodies, to build the micro-adjustments into reflex rather than calculation. The slowest man finished in 2 hours 50. No one turned back. Dalbir climbed last both nights, moving behind them in the darkness, occasionally placing a hand briefly on a boot sole to redirect a foot to a better hold, without a word being spoken. The third night, they went in darkness. At the same hour they would go on the real cliff. Full equipment, faces blackened with mud, rifle straps wrapped in cloth to prevent the metal of the buckles from finding each other in the dark. While the first man reached the top in 1 hour 51, the last man in 2 hours 19, 60 men, no rope, no sound that would have carried further than 10 feet. They came down and cleaned their equipment and ate what was available and went to sleep. There was no conversation about what they had done, no marking of the achievement. They were professional men who had completed a rehearsal, and the rehearsal had told them what they needed to know, and tomorrow they would rest. Then the night after that, they would do it once more on a different cliff with different consequences. There was one difference between this cliff and that one. On this cliff, if a man fell, he died. On the real one, 200 yards above them in the dark, 150 men with machine guns would be awake and listening. The signal was a hand on the shoulder of the first man. That was all. No word, no whistle, no gesture that could be seen or heard from above. On Dalbir's hand on Bir Bahadur's shoulder at 11:47 in the evening, and Bir Bahadur stepped forward out of the drainage ditch where 60 men had been lying still for 40 minutes and put his hands on the rock. The cliff was cold. That was the first thing. Not the height, not the darkness, but the cold of the limestone under his fingers. The way it pulled the warmth out of his palms immediately and completely, and the way the rock felt ancient and indifferent and absolutely without interest in whether he held on or not. He found the first hold, tested it, put his weight on it, found the next. 30 seconds later, the second man followed. Then the third, one by one, at 30-second intervals, until all 60 had left the ditch, and the ditch was empty and quiet, and the cliff face above it was alive with men that the darkness had already swallowed completely. They could not see each other. Yeah, that was the nature of this kind of dark. Not the dark of a cloudy night or an unlit room, but the specific dark of a cliff face that faces away from any ambient light, that has its own weather of shadow. Each man climbed alone, in a column that was invisible to itself. The man below you was somewhere beneath your feet, a presence you could not confirm. The man above you had been on this same rock 10 seconds before, had found these same holds sufficient, and that was all you had. You trusted the stone he had trusted, you moved where he had moved, You were connected to 60 other men by nothing more substantial than the logic of the route. The smell of the mountain came up through the dark. Wild thyme growing in the cracks between stones, dry and sharp, the particular smell of limestone that has held heat all day and is slowly releasing it into the night air. Somewhere below, water moving in a ditch. Somewhere above, nothing. No sound. No light. The German position as dark and quiet as if it didn't exist. At 100 feet, the angle steepened. It happened where Dalbir had told them it would happen, at the point where the lower cliff's relatively generous holds gave way to a section of near vertical face where the rock was older and smoother and offered less. Men slowed. The intervals between them stretched. The weight of the equipment, which had settled into a bearable negotiation over the first 100 feet, reasserted itself as the body's angle changed and the pack pulled differently and the rifle across the back shifted its weight forward and down. Ranbir Gurung was at the 140-foot mark when his left foot came off the rock. Not a long slip. His boot found a hold, weighted it, and the hold was not a hold. It was a ledge of limestone, perhaps 2 inches deep, that had looked from below like a reliable edge and was in practice a shelf with nothing behind it. And it gave. And his foot swung outward, and his weight shifted, and for one moment that lasted considerably longer than a moment, he was holding the cliff with his forearms and the tips of his fingers on a hold that had not been designed to take a man's full body weight at an outward angle. He did not make a sound. The not making a sound was not a decision. It was what happened when the body understands that sound is not an option and removes it from the available responses. He pressed his face against the rock. He felt the cold of it against his cheek. He held, and the hold held, and he counted, not deliberately, just the way the mind counts when it needs something to do, and at somewhere around 40 he found, with his right foot, a crack 2 inches lower and to the left that was narrow but deep, and that took his weight cleanly and with authority. Below him, a small stone tumbled free from where his boot had dislodged it. He heard it bounce once, twice, and then the soft impact of it, landing in dirt far below. He stayed completely still. Every man within hearing range stayed completely still. The mountain absorbed the sound and gave nothing back. No shout, no light, no change in the quality of the darkness above him. He found the next hold. He continued. At 280 feet, the first man's hand found the edge of the ledge. It was exactly where Dalbir had said it would be. 15 feet of flat limestone, hidden from the view of anyone above by a natural overhang that jutted out perhaps 3 feet from the cliff face. An accident of geology that had no tactical significance whatsoever until the night of June 13, 1944, when it became the most important piece of rock in Italy. The first man pulled himself up and lay flat on his back and breathed and did not speak, and after a moment rolled to his side to make room for the man behind him. They arrived one by one. Some came up gasping quietly, the hands shaking with the sustained effort of the final section. Some came up calm, or seemingly calm. There is a quality some men have of carrying their distress entirely inward, of presenting to the world a face that has decided not to report what the body is experiencing. They moved to the back of the ledge and sat with their backs against the cliff wall and waited for the man behind them. At 2:23 in the morning, the 60th man pulled himself over the edge. 2 hours and 36 minutes. The 60 men. Not one sound that had reached German ears. Not one man left on the cliff below. Not one piece of equipment dropped or lost or clanging against stone in the dark. Dalbir looked at his men. In the darkness he could not see their faces, only their shapes. 60 shapes sitting against a cliff wall 50 feet below the enemy, breathing slowly, saying nothing. Now they had to wait. 3 hours, 50 feet below the enemy, in total silence, without moving. And time moves differently when the body is not allowed to move. They had been still before, in ambushes, in positions, in the particular enforced patience of soldiers waiting for orders that were late arriving. But this was different. This was stillness with a ceiling. Above them, 50 feet of limestone, and above that, the German position waking up in the ordinary rhythms of a military garrison at the end of a quiet night. They could not see it. They could, occasionally, hear it, or hear the suggestion of it, the muffled sounds that limestone and distance reduced to the barest signal. A voice, perhaps. Something metallic, briefly. The sounds of men who did not know they had company. Some men on the ledge drank water. Small sips, careful. The canteen held away from the body when opened, so the sound of the cap didn't carry. Tilted slowly so the water moved without noise. Some checked their rifles. But not because the rifles needed checking, but because the hands needed occupation, and the rifle was the thing the hands knew best. The kukri was checked too, in the particular way Gurkha soldiers check a blade. Not drawn, just a thumb on the grip, confirming the looseness of it in the sheath, confirming it would come free clean and without resistance when the moment required it. Dalbir did not rest. He sat at the outer edge of the ledge, his back against the rock wall, and watched the rim above him. Not continuously. He let his gaze drop occasionally, rested his eyes, looked at his men. But he came back to the rim. There was a quality to his watching that was different from vigilance in the usual sense. It was not anxious. It was the watching of a man who has accepted the terms of the situation completely and is simply waiting for the situation to develop, the way a hunter watches a tree line, not hoping, not fearing, just present. When the hours passed, the way hours pass when you are not permitted to fill them, men closed their eyes. Not sleep, no one slept, or no one slept deeply, but the maintenance shutdown of a body that has been asked to do considerable work and is being asked now to hold itself in reserve for more. The mind does strange things in that state. It wanders without permission to places it has no business going at 4 in the morning on a cliff face in Italy, a village in the hills northeast of Kathmandu. The smell of a cooking fire, the sound a goat makes in the early morning when it wants to be let out. Small things, the particular texture of the ordinary life that a man carries with him into the extraordinary one, that surfaces in exactly these moments, because the mind requires something it can hold without effort. Dalbir thought about the pebble in his breast pocket. He had forgotten it was there until this moment, and now he was aware of its weight, negligible, at the weight of a large coin, and its shape, and the fact that he had picked it up from the base of this cliff 3 days ago as a kind of proof. Not proof to anyone else. Proof to himself that he had stood here, had read this cliff, had decided it was climbable, and that the decision had been correct. He had 60 men on a ledge that 3 days ago existed only in his assessment of a limestone face from 100 yards away. The proof was in the pocket. The rest was up to the next few hours. At 4:15, the darkness changed. It did not become light. It became less dark, which is a different thing. A shift in the quality of the blackness, from the solid, textureless dark of deep night to something that had gradation in it, that suggested depth, that was beginning to admit the possibility of dawn without yet committing to it. Black became the particular deep blue that has no name in any language Dalbir knew, because there is no need to name a color that only exists for 20 minutes and occurs only between night and the first light that is not yet light. He could see shapes. His men, resolving gradually from the darkness into the fact of their bodies, shoulders, the angle of a head, the line of a rifle held across a lap. By 4:30, he could see faces, not details, not expressions, but faces. At the oval of a face turned toward him in the gray half-light, he looked at them one by one. What he saw was not what most people mean when they talk about the face of courage, not the set jaw and the hard eye of men who have decided to perform bravery for an audience. These men had no audience. There was no one here to see them except each other and him. What he saw was simpler and more difficult to name, the face of people who have thought the thing through completely, who have accounted for every cost and found it payable, who are not waiting to see whether they can do this because they have already answered that question and moved past it. Readiness is the only word that comes close, though it misses something. It was readiness without tension, readiness that had been worn smooth by 3 nights on a practice cliff and 2 days of walking a mountain, and however many years of being the kind of person who ends up on a ledge like this. And every face he looked back at him the same way. He nodded once. No one spoke. At 4:47, a pair of German boots appeared at the rim of the cliff, 30 feet above them. The boots belonged to a private named Weiss, 22 years old, from a town outside Regensburg, who had come to the cliff edge for the same reason men have always come to cliff edges in the early morning, because the alternative was the latrine trench, which was occupied, as in the cliff edge afforded privacy and a view and 30 seconds of solitude before the day began. He was yawning when he looked down. The yawn stopped. 30 feet below him, 60 men in British uniforms sat on a ledge that should not have had anyone on it, looking back up at him with the patient, unalarmed quality of people who have been expecting this moment and are not surprised by its arrival. They were still. They did not reach for their rifles. They did not shout. And they simply looked at him, and he looked at them, and for 3 seconds the cliff held this arrangement without anyone doing anything to change it. Then Dalbir stood up. He rose from the ledge in one unhurried movement, and as he rose, he drew the kukri from its sheath and raised it above his head, and the blade, 18 inches of curved steel that had been kept sharp enough to split a hair, caught the first pale suggestion of morning light and held it. He was looking up at Weiss, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was in the same family as one, the expression of a man who finds the situation, if not exactly amusing, at least entirely within the range of what he had anticipated. He was calm. He was completely, utterly calm. And that calm, in the circumstances, was more frightening than anything else he could have offered. Weiss closed his mouth. He took 1 step back from the edge. Then he turned and ran. And the sound of his boots on the stone above them was the first loud thing that had happened in 2 hours and 36 minutes of climbing and 3 hours of waiting, and it seemed to Dalbir slightly excessive, the footsteps of a man whose body had made a decision somewhat ahead of his mind. He watched the rim. His men watched the rim. No one moved. Within 5 minutes, the rim was occupied again, this time by a different kind of presence. Steinhardt did not look down immediately, and he stood at the edge and gathered what he was seeing before he allowed himself to see it, the particular discipline of a man who has learned not to react to information before he has finished receiving it. Then he looked. 60 men on a ledge that his engineers had assessed as inaccessible, behind his walls, behind his guns, inside the geometry of a fortress that had been built with considerable care and expertise to make exactly this kind of presence impossible. He looked for a long time, and he was doing the same thing he had done every time the British sent something at him, assessing, calculating, running the variables. But the variables here were different. Every previous calculation had begun with the question of where the enemy was and what assets he had. This calculation began with a fact that restructured every subsequent question. The enemy was behind him, and the walls were facing the wrong way, and everything he had built to protect his men now enclosed them instead. And he called down in the English he had learned from a British prisoner in '43 and had been quietly improving since. He told them they had climbed well. He told them they were trapped. He offered terms, the terms of the Geneva Convention, the terms that soldiers offer when they believe they hold the stronger position and want to end the thing cleanly. His voice was measured. He was not performing confidence. He was making an argument he believed. Dalbir said nothing, and he looked up at Steinhardt for a moment with the same expression he had offered Weiss. that thing that wasn't quite a smile. And then, without hurry, he reached down and drew the kukri from its sheath. He did not raise it. He did not brandish it. He simply held it at his side in the easy grip of a man who has held this tool since boyhood and finds it no more remarkable than a hammer. He looked at Steinhardt. He waited. What happened next happened without an order being given, and which was the thing that Steinhardt would remember for the rest of his life, not the blades themselves, but the absence of any command that preceded them. 59 men reached for 59 sheaths, and 59 kukris came free in the same moment, and the sound that produced traveled up the cliff face and into the morning air above the German position, and was heard by every soldier in that garrison. It was not a loud sound. That was what made it what it was. A loud sound, a battle cry, and a volley of fire, an explosion, carried information you could process. This was quieter than that. 60 leather sheaths opening at once made a sound like silk being torn. And it lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and it said everything that Dalbir had not said in words, which was, "We are not going to surrender, and we are coming up, and you know what happens when we get there." Steinhardt turned from the edge and looked at his men. At the garrison of 150 soldiers who had held this position for weeks against everything the British Army had produced, looked back at him. They were good soldiers. They had done everything that had been asked of them, and done it well, and done it without complaint. Their faces were the faces of men who understood exactly what was below the cliff and exactly what it would mean when those men came over the top. They did not want to fight Gurkhas in the bunkers. Everyone in the German army knew the stories from North Africa and the stories from the previous months in Italy, and what those stories contained was consistent enough to have achieved the weight of fact. Nobody wanted to fight Gurkhas hand to hand. Steinhardt looked at his men's faces and understood what he was looking at. And Steinhardt, a man who had survived Stalingrad, who had been inside the worst thing the war had yet produced and had come out of it with his judgment intact, was not entirely sure he wanted to either. He walked away from the edge and stood in the center of the position and thought. This was what Steinhardt did when the situation required it. Not pacing, not conferring, not the performative deliberation of a man who wants to be seen deciding. He stood still and he thought. That with the same cold professional attention he had given to every tactical problem the war had presented him, because this was a tactical problem, and it deserved to be treated as one regardless of how it felt. The calculation was not complicated. That was the first thing he established, because complicated problems can be deferred, and this one could not. The Gurkhas were on the ledge. The ledge was 50 feet below the rim. His machine guns commanded the rim. When the Gurkhas began to climb the final 50 feet, the machine guns would fire, and they would kill men, many men, probably most of them, because 50 feet of open cliff face against prepared automatic weapons was not a survivable geometry for the attacking force. He knew that. He had been on the other side of that equation enough times to know exactly what it produced. Not all of them, though. That was the variable that the calculation kept returning to. Not all of them. And he had read the intelligence assessments. Every German officer in Italy had read them by now because the assessments had a quality that intelligence documents rarely possessed, which was that they were interesting. They described in operational detail what happened when Gurkha soldiers with kukris reached close-quarter range inside enclosed spaces. The detail was specific enough to have been assembled from direct observation, which meant that German soldiers had been in a position to observe it and had survived to report it, which meant they had been very lucky. The reports did not dwell on the luck. They dwelt on what happened to the men who weren't. He thought about the bunkers. He had designed the internal layout himself 3 months ago when they had first taken the position. The angles of the corridors, the placement of the interior barriers, the way the concrete rooms connected. And he had designed them to be defensible from the outside. He had not designed them to be defensible from the inside against men who had already breached the perimeter, because that possibility had not existed. The walls were facing the right direction for every threat he had anticipated. They were facing the wrong direction for this one. Some would make it over the top. He kept coming back to this. His guns would be firing, and the noise would be the noise of a serious firefight. And some Gurkhas would die on that last 50 feet, and some would not. And the ones who did not would come over the rim and into the position. And what happened after that would not be war in any sense the word usually meant. It would be room-to-room work in concrete corridors in morning light. Men with blades against men with rifles in spaces too small for rifles to be the decisive factor. And it would be very fast and very close, and it would not stop until it was finished. And when it was finished, some number of his soldiers, he could not calculate how many, only that it was not zero, would be dead in ways that he did not want to be responsible for. He looked at his men again. They had done everything he had asked. They had held this position against 3 assaults when other positions had fallen. They had maintained discipline and cohesion and professional dignity through months of siege. They were good soldiers, not exceptional. Not exceptional in the way that Dalbir Thapa's men were apparently exceptional, but rigorously, reliably good in the ordinary sense that armies require and rarely fully achieve. He thought about the ones he knew by name, the ones whose habits and complaints and particular qualities had accumulated over months into the kind of knowledge you acquire whether you intend to or not. Weiss, who had run from the cliff edge and was now standing 20 feet away, looking at him with an expression that was trying to be military composure and not entirely succeeding. Brandt, the corporal who played cards badly and knew it and played anyway. Mahler, who was from Munich and had a photograph of his daughter in his breast pocket and took it out and looked at it on Sundays. He thought about what he was being asked to weigh. On one side, the position, the pride of having held it. On the professional obligation to continue holding it, the expectation of his commanding officers that he would fight to the last viable option. He understood all of that. He had operated within all of that for 3 years and had found it on the whole a reasonable framework for the conduct of a soldier's life. On the other side, Mahler's daughter, who was 7 years old and whose name was Lisa, and who had been drawn in the photograph with her arms around a dog that had apparently died the previous winter, according to the letter that had accompanied the photograph, and Brandt, who played cards badly, and Weiss, who had come to the cliff edge for 30 seconds of solitude and found something that had turned his morning into something else entirely. He made the calculation. He made it honestly, without the comfort of pretending there was only one right answer. It's because he had been at war long enough to know that the answers that feel inevitable in retrospect never feel inevitable in the moment. He made it, and he stood with it for a moment, and then he turned and gave the order. The white flags came from the bunkers at 7:12 in the morning. German soldiers emerged into the daylight with their hands raised, blinking in the Italian sun with the slightly dazed quality of men who have spent months inside concrete and are being reintroduced to open sky. And they came out in ones and twos, then in groups, and they stood in the morning light and waited, and the mountain was quiet for the first time in months. Dalbir climbed the last 50 feet alone, ahead of his men. He came over the rim and stood on level ground and looked at Steinhardt. And Steinhardt looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Dalbir nodded. Once, briefly, on the nod of one professional, acknowledging another across the distance of everything that separated them and everything this morning that did not. He did not gloat. He did not smile. He turned and began to organize the surrender with the quiet efficiency of a man who has finished one task and is moving immediately to the next. The position that had cost 340 Allied casualties across 3 attacks over 23 days fell in 7 hours and 25 minutes. 0 Gurkha wounded, 0 shots fired. The British commanders who had twice called the plan suicidal received the report at 0900 hours. The first one read it through completely, set it down, and read it again. Then he read it a third time. Then he sent for his adjutant and asked him, in a tone that contained something unfamiliar in it, whether the casualty figures had been confirmed. They had been confirmed. The adjutant left. The commander sat alone with the report for a while longer. The news traveled faster than the Army intended it to. Armies run on official channels, dispatches, reports, the formal movement of information through chains of command that are designed to control what is known and when it is known and by whom. But soldiers talk, and prisoners talk to guards, and guards mention things to drivers, and drivers carry those things along with supplies to the next position and the next. And by the time the official report of what had happened at Steinhardt's fortress reached the relevant headquarters, the story had already arrived at most of the German positions on the mountain by a route considerably less formal and considerably faster. Within 72 hours, 17 German positions surrendered. Not all at the same time, not all in the same way, but with a consistency that told its own story. Some surrendered when they saw Gurkha units approaching, and some surrendered before they were approached. One commander sent a note out ahead of his white flag, a handwritten note, folded once, delivered by a private with his hands raised, that said only that they had heard what happened at Steinhardt's position, that they had cliffs too, and that they preferred not to discover what the Gurkhas could do with them. A British officer who received that note kept it. It appeared years later in a regimental history, quoted in full as the most honest document produced by either side during the entire Italian campaign. The German army, to its credit, treated what had happened as an operational problem requiring an operational response. Within 6 weeks, a new section had been added to the tactical guidance distributed to all field commanders in Italy. It addressed the question of Gurkha infiltration methods and what to do about them, and it contained, among its recommendations, the one line that a British intelligence officer underlined when the document was captured and translated and sent up the chain. The line said that if Gurkha units breached the perimeter of a position, commanders should consider immediate surrender rather than close combat, on the grounds that casualties in such engagements were operationally unacceptable. The British intelligence officer who underlined it wrote in the margin, in pencil, "They are not wrong." 2 weeks after the surrender, 3 American colonels drove out to Monte Cassino to see the cliff. They stood at the base and looked up for a long time. One of them said out loud what all 3 were thinking, which was that nobody could climb that. An old British sergeant who happened to be nearby, who had been at the base of the cliff on the night of June 13th, and had watched 60 men disappear into the darkness above him, and had spent 2 hours and 36 minutes in a drainage ditch not breathing particularly well, heard him and laughed. "That's what we all said, sir," he told them. Then we watched them do it. The Americans asked permission to attempt the climb themselves, in daylight, with full equipment and ropes. Permission was given. 6 hours later, 2 of the 3 had not reached the ledge. The third had made it. With 2 rest stops and a section of fixed rope on the upper face, and had sat on the 15 feet of flat limestone and looked out over the Italian countryside for a while before coming back down. All 3 agreed, in the report they subsequently filed, that the climb represented a physical and psychological achievement beyond what they had previously considered possible for soldiers in a combat context. That the report recommended that the U.S. Army investigate vertical infiltration as a tactical method. The cliff appeared on NATO mountain warfare training maps from 1950 onward. It had a name on those maps, not an official designation, not the kind of name that went through channels and received approval, the kind that accretes around things that have earned it. Every map, every training manual, every after-action study that referenced the cliff at Monte Cassino called it the same thing, a Gurkha's ladder. Dalbir Thapa went home in 1946. The British Army gave him the Victoria Cross at a ceremony in Italy before the regiment shipped back to Nepal, and he accepted it in the way he accepted most things, without performance, with a brief nod, with the quality of a man receiving something he knows he has earned but does not feel the need to display. He put it in his pack with his other belongings and carried it home on the transport ship and then overland to Sindupalchok, and to the village that did not appear on most maps, to the mountain that had made him what he was before the war had any opportunity to contribute. He went back to the goats and the barley, back to the steep paths and the limestone he had known before any other limestone. His neighbors knew he had been a soldier because everyone knew who had gone, but he did not tell war stories, and when they asked, he said what he always said, that he had done what needed doing and that many others had done more, and that the barley needed attention. His children grew up knowing their father had served. They did not know the details. He did not offer them. He died in October 1968, at the age of 50, from causes that had nothing to do with the war. His eldest son, Kiran, went through his belongings in the days after the funeral with the careful, slightly stunned attention of a person who is learning, in retrospect, who his father was. In the drawer of the small wooden chest beside the bed, wrapped in a piece of cloth that had once been part of a uniform, was the Victoria Cross. Kiran knew what it was. He had seen pictures. He held it for a long time. Beneath it was a smooth gray rock, the size of a large coin, and a letter. The letter was dated June 1946, written in English in a neat hand, on paper that had survived 22 years in a drawer in a Himalayan village with the slightly brittle quality of paper that has been preserved by dryness and by care. It was from a man named Aldous Fentiman, who identified himself briefly and without elaboration, and it said that he had gone back to Monte Cassino after the war ended and climbed to the ledge in daylight, and that he had picked up this rock from the surface of it and was sending it to Dalbir because it had been under his feet on the night he had done what everyone said could not be done. The last line said, "Impossible is not a fact. It is a failure of imagination. Keep it." Kiran set the rock on the table beside the medal. He looked at both of them for a while. Outside, the mountain his father had grown up on caught the late afternoon light in the way it always did, the limestone going pale gold and then orange, the shadows deepening in the familiar places. His father had never mentioned any of it. Not once. That, Kiran thought, was perhaps the most Gurkha thing about the whole story. Not the climb, not the blades, and not the surrender of a German fortress without a shot fired. It was the drawer, the metal in the cloth, the rock kept for 22 years without explanation, the man who did the impossible and then went home and tended his barley and said nothing, because the doing of it had always been the point, and the talking about it had never been.